Welcome to Generative AI and State Tax Administration. I'm Philip Behrendt, chair of the tax law section of the Beverly Hills Bar Association. The tax section is sponsored by Hochman Sorg and Torsha Perez. The Hochman Sorg and Torsha Perez PC advantage is experience, an eye for innovation, and genuine dedication to clients, their families, and their business. The firm is also active in and successful in handling civil tax and criminal tax controversies and related litigation in federal and state courts. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, Brian Oliner and Travis Thompson. Travis Thompson is director at Fenmore's Business and Finance Practice Group, where he advises clients on complex tax matters, including litigation, refund claims, voluntary disclosures, and cross-border compliance. He has represented clients in high-profile cases involving FBAR, cryptocurrency, and international tax issues, and frequently writes and speaks on the intersection of tax law and technology. Travis also served as founder and chair of the ABA Tax Section's Tax Practice and Technology Committee. Brian Oliner is general counsel at the Federation of Tax Administrators, where he advises on tax compliance and enforcement issues, drawing on over 14 years as principal counsel to the Comptroller of Maryland. His background spans government service, private practice, and frequent speaking on tax administration. He is a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Law and University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And now, let's get started. We can't wait to see what you have prepared to share for us today.
Thank you, Philip. Okay. Did everybody see that?
Yep.
Very good. Well, hey, thank you to the Beverly Hills Bar Association for allowing us to speak today. My name's Travis Thompson. I'm a director at Fenimore, based out of Walnut Creek, California. Really excited to be speaking with Brian today about generative AI, AI generally, and state tax administration. I think every great conversation about what's going on in the tax world related to the AI starts with what is AI. But before we do that, let's just go through a brief agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world, why all this AI talk. Context is important, and practitioners around the United States need to understand, why is this moment so important for the purposes of artificial intelligence and tax. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the feds are doing and the executive orders from the White House related to AI, especially through the Biden and Trump administrations. And then we'll discuss a little bit about what the IRS is doing. And now the CDTFA, and then Brian will cover some more of the state policy around AI and what we'll see moving forward. So look, I always start with this particular slide. It's very important because AI is not so simple to define, right? But the best, simplest definition that we may have is machines acting in ways that seem intelligent. I'm sure if we all asked every tax practitioner in Beverly Hills or in California what artificial means, we would likely get a very similar definition as to what artificial meant. It's that intelligence definition that I'm sure we would get very different responses to, especially in this day and age. So the best definition that I was able to find for intelligence came from someone who studied AI at MIT named Howard Gardner and at Harvard. And he said that intelligence is the ability to solve problems or to create products that are valued within one or more cultural settings. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. AI is here to stay. And if you're not using it at this moment, then I highly encourage you to get trained up as soon as possible because it's a major paradigm shift in the way that we practice tax, both federal and state. Just real quick, there's a lot of convoluted messages out there about what AI is, but more importantly, where it fits within the definitions of artificial intelligence, especially this new generative AI piece, Perplexity, ChatGPT, those modules. And so what I like to do is just break it down real quick into, the categories of AI and why that's important. So first off, I think many practitioners, just like in the 80s when Terminator came out, think, AI is going to take over our jobs. It's going to become self-aware. It's going to be like HAL in 2001. It's going to be like Terminator. And that type of AI is disputed at a very high level amongst academics and professionals, and falls within a category called general AI. Many, if not all, the practitioners of artificial intelligence, the actual builders of it around the globe, many believe it'll never ever occur, but there are these other professionals and subset of folks that believe it will. But as of now, there's no evidence to suggest that general AI will ever become a thing. If you ever want a great thought experiment around this, I would, ask you to go read what's called the Chinese room argument by Professor Searle, former Professor Searle at Berkeley. He talks about how computers don't have minds. He came up with this thought experiment in the 80s. And this is really kind of the main argument against general AI. For our purposes, what we like to talk about for AI is within the narrow AI scope, right? And narrow AI is really just machine-based systems designed to address very specific problems like playing chess. And I just want everybody to know that to date, all applications of AI are what are called narrow AI applications. So what are narrow AI applications? Well, robotics is definitely something we all know, right? Automated devices that perform physical tasks in the real world. We see that in Amazon centers, and we're very familiar with what robots are. The second one, natural language processing, you've probably heard of. We've all been using it. If I were live right now, I would ask the audience to put up their hand and tell me how many people own dictionaries on their desk. And many people, I get usually about 1 out of 100 that say they have a dictionary on their desk. And that comes because we all now value spell check as a natural language processing AI platform. The utility of spell check is much greater than actually having a dictionary on our desk or being an expert speller. So we've all been using natural language processing. Whenever we type something in Google, that's a form of natural language processing, especially when it knows what we're going to type next. So keep that in mind, that this has been part of our culture for a very long time. And so you've been using AI, whether or not you've known it or not. The most important one, though, for the purposes of today, for the purposes of the overall conversation about generative AI, is machine learning, which is just really powerful computer systems that crunch data, faster than they've ever been crunched, faster than it's ever been crunched before, right? And they use this data to predict and automate learning so that the systems themselves can predict and learn in the future, right? And so this forms the basis of, what our conversation is around AI, what's called large language models that are a subset of this machine learning. But really, these large data sets that exist are what are required in order for generative AI and artificial intelligence through machine learning to actually produce and work properly. This is a graphic I like to show folks. It's not very detailed, but it gives you a sense of, where we're at in this generative AI, chat GPT world. Inside of the deep learning, machine learning, and artificial intelligence scope, you see it falls under the category of narrow AI or machine learning. So what's all the fuss? Like, why is this a big deal? Well, unlike previous AI systems, the thing that makes generative AI so special is its ability to create. And when you really take a look at everything that has come before OpenAI and ChatGPT, none of those predictive algorithms ever were able to take data sets and then create, paragraphs using language, the most important caveat here, in ways that seemed cogent or reasonable, especially when it came to the tax code or law in general, right? But that is why this is so special, is generative AI can create, unlike previous AI. And that obviously poses a whole set of issues for lawyers and accountants and practitioners that they need to understand and deal with because, and I'm sure you've heard about it, yes, it can create, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. And I'm talking about the concept of hallucinations and what happens when the systems that are not based on law in the code create fake cases that attorneys have been putting inside of briefs that are submitted to courts. So keep that in mind, right? That is why we're having this conversation today, because anything that can create in language can be very valuable as a tool for state and federal tax agencies. Now, aside from its ability to create, like, what is this other thing that's happening on the back end? Why now? And really it just comes, why the rise in artificial intelligence all of a sudden? Well, it comes down to the one word, which was data, or data as some people say, right? I'm a Star Trek fan, I use the word data. So look, there's never been ever in the history of technology or even mankind the amount of accumulated data as there is right now in our culture, right? Literally, if you look at the amount of data that Google and everybody is storing, it's more now in the last 5 minutes than it's probably stored in the last hour, right? And then within the last hour, it's probably more than it's been stored in the last week. And the reason for that is it's never been less expensive, and the computers have never been faster to actually process this type of data. And so in order for artificial intelligence systems to run thoroughly and effectively, they actually need it. They need it. When I tell people that I don't look at this as a cell phone anymore, I look at it as a data accumulator with lots of apps, with companies that are competing for me to interact with those apps. Those apps are what generate the data to feed the artificial intelligence systems on the back end for the various companies, Facebook, social media, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? Everybody is competing for you to interact with their respective apps because they want the data that you provide to make their systems on the back end faster and more reliable. AI is worthless without data. It's worthless. So the more of it that it has, the better that it is. And if you really stop and think about it, who has the most proprietary data out of all of the agencies, right, in either state or the federal government? It's tax data. The IRS, and in California, the California Franchise Tax Board, have billions, trillions of terabytes of data that is not being used effectively to determine or enforce, the tax code. So just keep that in mind, that these agencies are getting smarter and faster with their technology tools in order to process the data that they previously haven't processed. And because of it, it's supposed to make the administration of the tax laws more efficient and better for society as a whole. But as we will talk about later, there's going to be some hiccups, right? Especially when it comes to ethics and, bias, but also just, enforcement efforts as a whole and who's being targeted and who isn't. So next slide. And again, the computing power, which I already talked about, is literally the fastest it's ever been. So data, computing power allowed for generative AI to even be a thing. And now we have ChatGPT, and how that plays in with the overall scheme of the tax code and state and federal agencies using it. That's what we'll talk about today. So rather than create separate slides for each of the various executive orders that seem to come out of the current administration now every other day, I just decided to list all of the executive orders that pertain to AI from Biden and Trump too. And as you can see, it's rather substantial, right? So the Biden administration, when they were first teeing up their executive orders around AI, were very concerned. They had just come off having the Inflation Reduction Act funding, but they were also very concerned with the concept of bias, especially racial bias. And what they did is they directed all of the agencies in the federal government to essentially write up reports that they would submit to the White House on how they were using AI and how they planned to eliminate bias and how they plan to manage the future of the implementation of AI. And a lot of it centered around the concept of ethics, but also just to get like an overall summary of how the agencies were using this technology at the time. I think the Biden administration only gave the agencies like 6 months to respond after the executive order came out. And you can go read what Treasury put together for its department and the Internal Revenue Service, if you like. But for the purposes of our conversation today, it's super in depth and rather lengthy, and it wouldn't fit into us focusing on the states. So when Trump came in, you may have seen in the news and through the various tax notes publications or whoever that their focus, especially teaming up with Doge and every leader it seemed like in Silicon Valley on AI, their focus really was on getting a grasp in their way on how the federal government would use artificial intelligence in the past. So it immediately rescinded all the Biden executive orders on AI, but then it wrote its own AI executive orders that came out right when Trump came into office. You can see January 20th. He didn't even waste any time. January 20th, 23rd, boom, boom. He comes out with 2 executive orders. Now, when you go read these, they're not dissimilar from what President Biden and his team had put together. They're just not. They use, language about eliminating, woke decision making inside of AI and other various aspects of what you're hearing out of the current administration related to, how government is working. But the reality is most of the AI executive orders that they've been putting together were really put out there because one, Doge was asking for it, but also 2, they were looking for ways to make the IRS more efficient and downsize its workforce. So by implementing these executive orders, they have and are attempting to find ways to use technology with the current Inflation Reduction Act funding still, find ways to use technology to streamline the processes at the IRS and throughout the federal government as it relates to AI. Now that they have the funding to do that, and they thought this was an ample opportunity to eliminate actual humans from the workforce in order to implement those particular systems. So you hear them going back and forth on this, but they are fully focused now on implementing various AI systems into the IRS in order to enforce the future tax laws and current tax laws. So AI is going to be very prominent in the future of the IRS. And as practitioners, we need to understand the language that, obviously encapsulates that and how we can best represent taxpayers moving forward. So right here, removing barriers. I think this is actually a typo, sorry. But this is what I just talked about. I just had the Trump administration eliminating all the Biden administration's AI policies, but also, they'll use words like America's dominance, promote human flourishing, this very colorful language to do the exact thing that the Biden administration was doing with their executive orders around AI. And of course, the concept of being free of ideological bias, they added the word ideological, whereas the Biden administration simply used the word bias, which is talked about often inside AI circles when it comes to government use of AI. This is a comment from Treasury Secretary Besson on May 6, 2025. We are taking the IRS back to where it was before the Inflation Reduction Act bill substantially bloated the personnel and the infrastructure. I believe through smarter IT, through this AI boom, that we can use that to enhance collections. So I included that as just, validation of the points that I'd made earlier. In 2023, to go back a little bit, maybe you guys don't know or have never heard of the RAS department inside of the IRS. That stands for Research and Applied Analytics and Statistics Group. And that, prior to Trump coming in, was the most technologically advanced group inside of the IRS, where they tested new AI systems, where they managed use cases, where they were trying to determine, with vendors what the best possible systems were moving forward for the IRS. I call these guys the Big Bang Theory guys. I mean, super smart, MIT, Harvard, Yale, computer engineers, Berkeley, Stanford, all folks that had computer engineering backgrounds or economics backgrounds, could write algorithms and work in technologically advanced spaces. So this is where the IRS was going with its hiring practices prior to Trump too. And you can see that, they were sending out requests for, information or requests for proposal on various aspects of AI. This is just related to LB&I, where they were looking to implement AI to, accurately select returns and reduce the no change rate. So look into RAS. It's kind of a cool department. Admittedly, I can't speak to its level of sophistication right now because of all the changes at the IRS, but the Research and Applied Analytics and Statistics Department, which used to be run by the guy that brought data analytics into the MBA, used to be a pretty cool spot for what the IRS was doing with AI. We're still waiting for some updates to see how they're doing moving forward. These are just some applicable authorities that the IRS has used around AI and you know, in the IRM. We have the OMB memorandum. I won't read this whole slide, but really, like, this is just to show you that, you know, internally they've put parameters around AI usage. They're very conservative with their implementation of it, even to this day. And the reality is, when TIGTA went back and looked at how they were actually using it in the report November 12, 2024, these are various AI related systems that are both in use and in development at the AI. You can in development at the IRS, you can see 68 AI projects in total. I can tell you that the IRS Criminal Investigations Unit has been using Palantir and other data analytic systems for quite some time, you know, going on 7-8 years now, in order to build cases within CI. This was all very, I think, very surprising to folks, the way that the TIGTA report laid out exactly how they were using artificial intelligence or looking at using it. But, you know, this is meant to show you that it's one of the top priorities at the IRS. 12 of those projects were to improve customer service. 27 of those were to improve the enforcement efforts of the IRS. And then 29 of those just with improving the overall operations of what was going on at the IRS and improving the efficiencies internally. Well, is the IRS using generative AI? They're exploring it. They've made some recent comments about using it. They're in the early stages. The IRS Chief Technology Officer said that while AI is well established, generative AI is different for the reasons that we talked about earlier. But they are testing whether or not Gen AI could possibly help in customer service situations. They're worried about accuracy. They're worried about bias. They're worried about questionable sources. There are ways to combat that by, you know, narrowing down the field of data that the AI is using to come up with its answers. But as of right now, and you know, anecdotally, I can tell you in conversations with personnel at the IRS, they are not, to my knowledge, as of now, using generative AI applications at the IRS. America's AI Action Plan. Well, this was kind of recent, but yeah, so this came out really as like an announcement to the states. You know, I put this in here because essentially what the federal government is saying in this particular order is, you know, any discretionary funding that should be considered for the states for AI related instances should be hindered if the states themselves are, you know, implementing policies that go against the federal government related to the federal government's AI policies. You know, according to the White House, not all the states are doing that. Some states are effectively implementing AI systems, but this is really kind of a shot across the bow to the states to let them know that the possibility of pulling funding to the states based on their not getting on board, so to speak, with the administration's full-fledged efforts to promote AI inside of the United States could possibly reduce funding to the states. This is also extremely recent. There was a Tax Notes article that came out gosh, I want to say last week, that dug into how the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration was using generative AI technology. And they made an announcement that as of August 22nd of last month, they launched their generative AI solution. This was the result of 3 contracts that were signed by Governor Newsom earlier in the year with a company called Simsoft Solutions LLC to implement generative AI systems inside of not just the CDTFA, but other agencies. According to the CDTFA, they are using it for customer service interactions and essentially, using the internal data of the CDTFA only is what, I took from this. The customer service agents at the CDTFA will use the tool and to answer questions for customers, and they will have the power of whether or not to actually give the taxpayer on the other line or the other end of the phone that answer. So they will be the person, they will be the guardrail, so to speak, of any answers that the generative AI comes up with. One could imagine in situations where you have entry-level employees working in customer service positions at the taxing agencies, how this could be an extremely effective tool to helping taxpayers, especially unsophisticated taxpayers that can't, hire lawyers or accountants, answer questions about the tax code, about laws related to the tax. They can't give legal advice, but they can give overall, references to materials and forms and other things that can help taxpayers in an efficient manner, and they can do it rather quickly. So as overall the utility of this particular tool inside of the customer service department at the CDTFA, I think is going to be a very, very good thing. But there are experts out there that are not so enthusiastic about the CDTFA's use of this technology. So it'll remain to be seen, how it goes. Now I want to pass it over to Brian to talk about what the Federation of Tax Administrators thinks about all this. Brian, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you, Travis. Philip, the Bar Association, thank you for inviting me. As indicated before at the top of the program, I am general counsel with the Federation of Tax Administrators. Before I joined FTA, I was in the Maryland Attorney General's office and was their general counsel representing the Maryland Comptroller's Office, which is our Department of Revenue in the state of Maryland, for some 14 years as general counsel, and a number of years before that just among the regular soldiers of the office. As a caveat, when I start any of these presentations, because I tend to get opinionated sometimes, I have to say these are my opinions. They're not the opinions of the FTA, should I go down that road. I mean, Travis gave us a nice introduction that points to the fact that we've all been using AI in a traditional, simple sense, if you will, for decades. Spell check is the biggest example that always comes to my mind. And it's evolved, obviously, over the years to the point now where it's gotten a little bit further. So it anticipates what we're going to type. We're going to text a message or we're writing a letter. It starts throwing out potential text for us and those things. And departments of revenue, similarly, have been using AI in some format for a long time. Think back to the 1980s and 1990s, when there was what they would call rule-based systems and expert models, that early forms of smart automation that would get applied, codifying human rules to structure problems and therefore filtering tax returns where you would see obvious anomalies for the administrations. Machine learning and analytics, statistical methodologies that allowed for computers to spot patterns. Natural language processing, which I think Travis mentioned. The robotic process automation. And OCRs, optical recognition software, was a big advance, but that is AI. When you scan a document into your Adobe and it can use OCR to actually recognize words and text, and you can search it, that's AI at work in the simple. So now we're into the generative AI. Before I kind of jump into my slide here, the one thing I want to point out with when Travis was talking about the America's AI Action Plan back on July 23rd, this is kind of a reaction to what was in HR 1 in the reconciliation bill. There was a provision in the original text of the reconciliation building that would have put a moratorium on states to do anything in the generative or the AI world in terms of regulating, putting guideposts in, guardrails, I think is the term we would use, to, if you want to use those systems, here are the guardrails that you got to be doing. That got stricken from the reconciliation bill. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't come back in legislation down the road, but that AI action plan is the direct result of that. Okay, we didn't get it in the bill, but now if you states try to do anything to regulate AI in any manner, and we're not talking about regulating it out so it can't be used, but just talking about some of the safeguards I'm going to go through in a moment to protect consumers, to protect private entities, to protect the public, to make sure it's done right and done well so that we can actually achieve the goals that we want to. They just didn't want, these things just are trying to stop the states from trying to do those things that the federal government, Congress is not doing. And it's of concern to the state. So across state tax centers administration, you've got multiple uses of generative AI that they're looking at and starting to consider. So like I've listed a number of them up here: consumer contact and service delivery. This again was something Travis was talking about. You call up your especially during tax season, you call your revenue agency and say, hey, I've got a question about what I can do and how I can do it in a form. Using generative AI programs, if they're able to do it, will actually be able to listen to what a customer is asking on the other end. And it could be a practitioner as well as a regular taxpayer trying to do their own return, and get them to the right person, get them to somebody with the knowledge and or access forms, explanatory documents that Department of Revenue has, and get it to the customer in real time, freeing up the human services, the human resources to be able to address more complex issues. That's a goal that's going to be positive for everybody. It's going to help the practitioners because they're going to be able to there will be people with knowledge that they can get through to. It's going to help the average taxpayer, the average business owner who's just got a quick question. How do I fill out my this month's sales and use tax return? And if they can get somebody to get some way to get a simple answer quickly, frees up them, frees up you. Staff support, knowledge management, same idea. This is the behind the scenes use of AI services to help the people that work at the agencies also to access the information. You're always onboarding new people. You're always advancing and moving up the chain, up the ladder as you become more knowledgeable. But the ability to get the Department of Revenue employees to their sources of information sooner and quicker educates them, gets them doing the job right, and helps again with you. Excuse me. Return processing. I think we'd all agree that this is one of the core services and functions of the Department of Revenue. Machine learning models can rapidly validate returns, rapidly check those returns with rules and filters that have been put into place to evaluate whether the returns are proper. And by using generative AI, they can learn from the responses they get back. They become better at that maybe identifying other rules that can help move returns through processing faster, getting refunds out to taxpayers quicker, getting things processed. And if there's a question, asking it sooner of the taxpayer or the practitioner. Instead of waiting months, maybe it'll be days that you'll get something back. Those are the goals, those are the aspirations, but this is what these types of tools can do. Fraud detection and the shadow economy. Again, these tools can give us, can dig down deeper to analyze vast amounts of data to see the unusual patterns. There are third-party platforms out there that allow tax agencies to uncover undeclared and underreported income by combining those types of databases into what the revenue agencies are using. Again, revenue agencies just want everybody to be reporting what they're required to report under the law and paying what they're required to pay under the law. No more or no less, just like that's all your clients want to have to do. But if we can weed out the bad actors by having filter systems and other detection devices, again, it helps the taxpayers that just want to do right by getting the bad apples, if you will, out of the way. Audit compliance and enforcement, same idea, same thoughts as what we're looking at there. Collection and debt recovery. Again, there are platforms out there that you can tie into that help a revenue agency determine whether or not a particular taxpayer who has a debt has the ability to pay, and if so, what's a reasonable collection program. The taxpayer, again, most of them, they know they may owe something, they just don't know their ability to pay is compromised, and the ability to enter into a payment program, for example, that's going to work for both the agency and the taxpayer is good for both parties. It doesn't overburden the taxpayer and just set them up for failure. And to be able to access those other platforms, to be able to create that information, to do that is what we want to be able to do. Policy modeling and forecasting. This is, I think, very critical in the idea of using these generative AI tools when your legislature goes in and says, oh, we want to do this new tax. And this is how we expect, this is how we, the legislators, thinks it's going to work, and the type of income and revenue it's going to produce, and the side effects of that, the cost to retailers or to businesses or to individuals. They want to be able to model that out. These tools for modeling and forecasting that are starting to come about, that are already on existing platforms, are going to make that modeling and forecasting better, so that the legislature is much better informed about whether this is the right type of revenue raising, or maybe they want to eliminate a tax. And should that be appropriate? Again, modeling and forecast become critical for that. And these new tools are going to help with all that. Data analytics and cross-matching. We've been doing this for a long time within revenue agencies, where the returns come in and you're matching it to W-2s and 1099s. Again, as the tools get better, the cross-matching gets better and helps everybody in the long run. That's what you want to do. And then, of course, communication and outreach. And this isn't necessarily the call centers where you're getting calls in, but if you need to send a letter to a taxpayer, traditionally with more limited tools, it tended to be a script letter. It was the same letter that's going to be going to Travis as it's going to Philip, even though that they're slightly different based upon their returns, but because they were limited in the way they could customize a letter. These generative tools, as the platforms improve and get better, are going to help revenue agencies be able to create more customized letters to go to taxpayers, so that they're prepared and know how to respond to them or to answer questions. They're not going to get a generic answer. They're going to get something that's better and more directed to their actual inquiry. Travis, if you could knock that next slide up. So security and safeguards. So now these are what I'll go through now. What I think you need to know as to what the agencies are thinking. They want to put these tools in place that are being told by the higher ups to other organizations. You need to put these tools in place. But as revenue agencies, unlike some other agencies, there's a lot of limitations or considerations that have to be taken into account when you're going to develop these programs. So starting with the security and safeguards. I'm sure folks here on the call are familiar with IRS publication 1075. 1075 controls how the agencies or how somebody is going to handle federal tax information. And why is that important? As I'm sure again you know, your state Department of Revenue has working agreements with the Internal Revenue Service for sharing of data. And when it comes from the IRS to the states, that's federal tax information, or FTI, which is protected under multiple provisions of the Internal Revenue Code, can only be disclosed under certain conditions. And when it is disclosed to a third party, in this case, I'm talking about your state revenue agencies, there are a number of protections that have to be in place. These include protections that to the access, who has access to the information, how the information is labeled, how it is in fact stored. I remember when they were doing audits in the Maryland Comptroller's Office, and the IRS does that every 3 years or so. They come in and they look at a state's how they're doing in safeguarding. I think there was the 3-lock rule. There had to be 3 locks between the public and FTI. And that was the lock on the door, the lock on the file cabinet, and maybe another lock into the building. Those things, they have to be taken into consideration, and we can't ignore them just because now we're using generative AI tools. So we have to be thinking about that, as well as finally transmission of the data and then disposal and destruction of the data. These have to be taken into consideration when you're going to start using these large language models that are going to use the data that Travis was talking about, the trillions of data, of bytes of data that your state tax revenue agencies have. If you're going to use those to inform other programs and other systems, these safeguards from publication 1075 have to remain in place. The other thing is open government laws. You have open records, open meetings, FOIA. All these are out there. So state agencies are constantly getting FOIA requests that may or may not trigger information that is confidentiality laws prevent from disclosure. And you have to have the ability to make sure that you are protecting that and or editing that. So there always has to be a human resource, some human being in place to be able to review things to make sure these systems are working properly. Violation of these disclosure rules, they're criminal offenses, and state employees can go to jail if they improperly disclose confidential state or federal tax information. So they don't take these rules lightly, and they're very concerned about it. And when I was counsel to the Comptroller's Office, I was always making sure that our employees were not doing something wrong. I'd rather have them come and ask questions to make sure they're not disclosing something. So now we have to think about those kind of guardrails in a revenue agency to be able to take advantage of these new tools that are out there while still protecting and safeguarding the information that is going to be used. And that comes to one of the things I have listed there is the HITL, which is just another acronym for human in the loop oversight. And that's what I was just talking about. You need to have humans in the loop to make sure that that things are being done properly, that let's say you create a digital way to screen for information, but you have to continuously be updating those screening tools to make sure A, they're working, 2, they're not missing something that they need to be revised or reworked in some way. You need to be able to classify and segregate the outputs from AI and the inputs from AI. So you need to be able to distinguish between what's sensitive taxpayer information, what may be not taxpayer information, but is personally identifiable information like Social Security numbers, names, addresses, something like that, and then the administrative records, which are usually open to public inspection. You need to be able to distinguish with that. And that all, again, like I say, these are the rules that are in place today that we need to make sure we're continuing with Department of Revenue's develop these policies that stay in place as we move into the AI world. You also need to be able to account for the resource intensive or customization required when if you use a cloud-based or a third-party storage system. Let's say that your Department of Revenue wants to now stop saying, we're not going to store all our data on servers at our particular IT center, but we're going to go to a cloud-based system. Well, they're not going to be using and creating their own cloud-based system. They're probably going to be using it from a third-party provider. So they have to be very concerned about making sure those third-party providers have the appropriate security protocols in place to protect that data. This area right here is probably one of the defining challenges for the agencies, that balancing of security and disclosure obligations with the great potential that AI is going to provide. So, I mean, I would summarize all this as to how you all help the departments of revenue. As you're hearing me describe this, these are human resource intensive programs and policies that need to be put in place. So when your legislatures or whomever it is pushing for AI in the tax administration area, they have to understand there's a cost that's associated with that. And if the private sector wants to have and take advantage of the efficiencies that are going to be built in with this system when it does this, be partners with your departments of revenue to be able to make sure everybody understands that there's going to be long-term efficiencies and productivity that's going to come out of this, but there is a cost to being able to do it. That cost will be outweighed over the long run, but there are going to be upfront costs. Travis, if you can pop over to that last slide for me. So these are the considerations from my perspective as counsel to, if I was counsel to a revenue agency, there's legal and ethical. Again, we've talked about the data privacy and protection and making sure those laws are being complied with. When I talk about intellectual property rights, a lot of times these AI tools are being provided by third-party contractors to the agency. Something, maybe they're upgrading their systems, maybe they have a data warehouse, at least that's what we called it in Maryland, in which data is stored, but it's their outside contractors, third parties that are helping to put these in place. And they're using the data in there to create as the large language model to create the signs to address and identify anomalies. Who owns that intellectual property once that database is created? It sounds simple. I mean, from my perspective, obviously it should be the state owns that IP and owns that thing, that large language model that did that. But from the contractor standpoint, if not only are they using the data from their contract with the state of California, but they're using the data they're generating from the state of Iowa and from North Carolina, the larger the language models, in theory, the better the identifications are going to be out there. So they want to be able to use that data also. So believe it or not, there actually are fights that arise as to who owns that language model and the database from which it was created. And just as you can guess, that can be complicated. Liability and accountability. You use a generative AI tool. Travis calls up the desk and says, can I take my dog as an exemption? And for some reason, the generative AI says, absolutely, you can take that cute poodle and it can now be your next dependent on your tax return. I'm not real familiar with California law, but I'm going to guess that's not allowed under California law. Whose liability and accountability is for that? If you're using a third-party vendor that's helped you to create this, are they going to be the one that's going to have to assume the liability for that, or is that your Department of Revenue? My guess is that there's a compromise in there. Ultimately, a taxpayer is going to have to pay the tax because it was wrong, but interest and penalty, if they get assessed, that has to be determined who would be liable and accountable for that type of thing. And the states need to work that out with the vendors and whoever they're working. So if you're seeing, these are issues that we're working on behind the scenes. You're never going to see it, but these are the things we're concerned about from the revenue department's perspective. The anti-discrimination laws we talked about, Travis talked about this. This is really the bias area. There are protected classes out there. There's a number of stories out there that you've probably seen in the press where, and the study that came out from the Biden administration about how certain models were created, but they ended up targeting certain populations just because those populations happen to be prevalent in that particular uh, um, uh, tax benefit. I think of the earned income tax credit, for example. There was a lot, there's a certain population that's going to be taking the earned income tax credit. They end up getting overemphasized for audits. And then they start looking at zip codes, and they look at the zip codes where people live, and they start going after that, and that gets targeted. And that tends to be, it's dangerously close to targeting people because of a protected class as opposed to being neutral. So we have to be very conscious of that. And again, there needs to be human expertise involved in developing the models that are going to be inputted into a system so the output isn't overly concentrating on populations just because they end up being in a protected class in some manner. I talked about regulatory compliance. This is where simply making sure whatever the statutes and regulations that are in place are being complied with through the use of the AI. And again, it may be third-party vendors that you're using in this area. On the ethical side, again, there's nothing magical in these terms I've used here, fairness and equity. That's a basic trademark or pillar of any tax system is you want it to be fair and you want it to be equitable, that everybody gets treated the same, everybody has the same information, the same knowledge, so that they will, at the end of the day, be able to know that the rules that apply to me apply to you. We still need to make sure that's happening in this world with AI, that continues. Transparency and explainability. Transparency is pretty obvious there. You want the models. If you're going to have a large language model that's evaluating data, you want to be transparent on how it's doing that evaluation. What are the rules that have been put in place through the model to evaluate that data? Explainability. When you want to be able to explain how it's happening, you want to be able to explain it not just for technical experts, but for people like myself who aren't technical experts. And my guess is you want it too as practitioners. If your client comes in and has been assessed and wants to fight that assessment, they want somebody to explain to them and you exactly what was it and how was it that assessment was done. And if it was using one of these AI generative programs, they want to be able to explain how that happened to be able to test to make sure that the results are legitimate and correct. So you need to be able to explain that. Human autonomy and consent. Again, this goes to making sure that AI, we understand that AI is there to augment. It's not there to undermine or replace the human people input into these programs. That's critical, I think, to making these to fill in the fairness and equity piece. That human autonomy and consent needs to be part of it. Accountability and oversight, harm prevention. Again, we're getting back to these are the considerations that, again, the systems need to be accountable to the users. And when we talk about the users, let's use an audit program, for example. The user is not just the auditor. The user is also the taxpayer at the end of the day who's going to see the results of that audit. The systems need to be accountable to the users, whomever they may be. There needs to be that oversight because this is an iterative process. You may have a program today that uses the parameters 1, 2, and 3, and as it uses those, we need to go back to make sure those parameters 1, 2, and 3 are appropriate, and we shouldn't be adding X, Y, and Z to that. That's where we are. That's what the departments of revenue are taking into consideration as they try to implement these programs that are being asked by them by all the heads of agencies, multiple players in the environment. I'm not sure if we had any questions out there, but there's 2 in there at least.
I don't see any.
If you click on the Q&A, somebody asks, is it really the low and middle income taxpayer that is targeted with AI review, since high income taxpayers have a more complicated return? They're all targeting is not a word that I like to use. We're not targeting them. The systems look for anomalies and returns. and identifies those anomalies. And then if that is anomalies suggest that there's a problem with the return will be questioned. Is it just low and middle income taxpayers? Not necessarily, but depending on the type of tax that you're talking about, it could be. So yes, there's I think it's MIT or one of the larger institutions that do these types of evaluations have noted where there is bias in income tax administration that you need to be aware of.
Yeah, that study was done by Stanford,
Thank you.
and I was in the room. It was actually North Carolina. It was a very specific state, a very specific tax credit that they looked at, because at the time, North Carolina was the only state that actually tracked race data.
Yeah.
Now they don't track that anymore. And obviously the IRS doesn't track it, and the other states don't track it either. And so the reason Stanford used that state was because of that, is because they were able to at least get some quantifiable data about race in that study. You were right, earned income tax credit. And what the study found was that because of the credit itself, it's
Yeah, I mean, there's income parameters on the credit, which are naturally going to be looking at certain.
It was a natural occurrence of bias because of who took the credit. I can tell you anecdotally, I was in the room after this study came out with a bunch of IRS personnel when we were talking about this study in Washington, D.C., and they were very upset
they were
at this particular study, just because they themselves felt like they weren't part of any type of bias in their enforcement efforts. I think the study was meant to show that sometimes there's unintended bias, whether or not it's intentional or not.
Yep.
And so, I want to be very clear here. It was a very specific study done by Stanford that was highlighted. The commissioner at the time definitely confirmed it to the Senate Finance Committee that it had been occurring, but it was very specific. And now, as it relates to race data, I think it'd be very difficult to determine bias based off that, because no states are measuring it and the federal government isn't either. So I want to be very clear about that.
No, I would agree with you, and I think it can be taken unfairly, but nonetheless, it is something that is of concern. There's one other question in the discussion there from Ruth Rowlett. How seriously can we take all this supposed security when the entire Social Security database was uploaded off the SSA from the Social Security Administration? That's separate. That's a different story. I personally, from the state tax administration perspective, we are extremely conscious of and serious about security and protecting taxpayer information. Brian Oliner is very supportive, at least of the 2 lawsuits that are out there trying to protect and prevent the sharing of data with the Department of Homeland Security. And if for no other reason, there's 2 reasons. One, as tax administrators, we've lived on a promise that was made to taxpayers that your data is safe. And that feeds into the second reason, because if your tax information isn't safe, our voluntary compliance system, where we rely on voluntary compliance for people to file their returns, is seriously in jeopardy. So from a state tax administrator's perspective, we take it seriously. What they're doing at the federal level is beyond us. We can't control it. But at the state level, we are constantly talking about how to make sure that state tax information stays secure and doesn't get compromised.
Yeah, I'll speak to the Fed side because I think what you look, Ruth, I can't answer that effectively either,
Yep.
right? What happened, you saw, and when the executive orders came out, what happened when the current administration came in was they immediately started focusing on AI as it related to the various agencies. I cannot tell you in all certain terms exactly what's going on with the privacy aspect of taxpayer data right now. I can't because there's been so much turnover. It's been hard to figure out who to speak with, who to invite to panels, or whether or not they're even invited in the future. I will say this. I think there has been a large subset of people that have joined the efforts of the current administration and learned about the law that they didn't know about, 26 USC 6103, that when they got on board and started, looking at taxpayer data and have been asked to share certain data, they've realized that if they work for the IRS, that's a crime. And in doing so, I think a lot of them have stepped back. I think a lot of people have rejected the requests because of 6103. And I think that's why we're starting to see so much turnover at the commissioner level. So while I cannot speak, intelligently about the privacy efforts of the IRS, I can tell you 6103 still exists. And if taxpayer data is shared by an IRS employee, it's a crime. So not to end on a low note, but really enjoyed speaking with everybody today. And if there are more questions, please filter them through the Bar Association, or you can find me on the Fenimore website. But thank you so much, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yep. Thank you all. Appreciate the time.